Later, I will get into a little bit of a social location so you understand a little bit about my own background and my experience. But I'm extremely mindful of the privileges I hold as a settler, and as a settler on Turtle Island and as a settler in Canada. Because in many ways, while both of my minority groups or both of my ancestries have come to Canada seeking refuge and opportunity, I'm very grateful for that opportunity for my family to progress. But I also recognize and will continually hold the colonizer of Canada responsible for the state-sanctioned violence it has and continues to perpetuate on Indigenous bodies and Black bodies in Canada. I'd like to just also make a note that this presentation is all about storytelling and telling your own story. And the practice of storytelling is a common Indigenous practice. Oral traditions are how education was shared. And in many cultures as well, both of my ethnic background cultures, oral histories are extremely important. But I bring that up because I like to draw the point of treaties, and I'd like to sort of illustrate the purpose of reconciliation, in which the Indigenous practice of oral storytelling, what you probably considered a Western practice of telling your story or the narrative, how they're both two similar things, and how both groups, both settlers and First Nations people, we can actually learn from one another and live in harmony under Treaty 13. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I am a woman of color from mixed race heritage. I come from lineage that is both Black and Indian. And again, I've recognized my very obvious social privileges that such as my economic status and my ability to obtain higher education. As Jennifer mentioned, I went to Ryerson University and I studied politics and governance. And it was there that I really got to discover my life's passion in ending gender equity and doing this work with everything that's in me. And we'll get a little bit into how I also found the social justice movement later. But really, I hope that if there's something that you remember about me, it's that my one passion in life is about ending gender inequity. I currently work as a project coordinator with the Women Abuse Council of Toronto. In my spare time, I am a policy and advocacy lead with the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce. And last but definitely not least, I am a principal consultant with Jessieket, a consulting firm that I started just recently, where I'm looking into creating more disaggregated research to impact social and policy change. So that's just a little bit about me, and we'll get into good stuff of the workshop. So I'm going to be sharing a story of how I found my self-worth. And this is my story and my narrative. It's short and sweet, but I hope that we can use this story or my story as a way to better understand how to craft your own story. So I'll begin. I've always felt like an outsider, especially with my family. I was the only one growing up in my family to look visibly different. And when I say different, what I really mean is Black. I grew up in an Indo-Caribbean household, which meant that my family carries values of South Asian culture. And these values extend into our notions or our understandings of beauty. From a very young age, I learned that I could never, nor could I ever, look like the image of what a South Asian person considered beautiful just by the way that I was. I was not fair-skinned, I didn't have silky hair, and my nose was kind of flat. And I started to notice these differences everywhere I go, in the people that I interacted with, in the movies that I watched, in the songs that I listened to, in the stories where there were heroines who looked nothing like me. or in the love interest, or the women who got to find love with somebody, they look nothing like I did. And so once I started to notice this clear difference between me, what I look like naturally, and what was happening in the world around me, it became an extremely sensitive part of my upbringing and my sense of finding myself. You know, looking back at it, I probably wouldn't have called it anti-colonialism or colonialism. At 7 or 8 years old, I didn't have that framework or that understanding to sort of break down where these understandings or these perceptions or these notions have come from. But looking back, I can definitely see that that's what it was. But when you're 7 years old, all you hear are, or I shouldn't say 7, probably closer to 10 or 11, where your image becomes especially important as you start to hit puberty. Those colonial notions were reinforced by family members, by the media that I engaged with, when I hear quite often, stay out of the sun, you'll get black. Ironic because I'm already black, but that's another thing. Sleek down your hair, rub your nose, up so that it can stay pointy. Don't rub your nose down when you sneeze or when you cough, because then it'll get flatter. Keep your hair straight. And my all-time personal favorite is a cream that was encouraged for me to use to lighten my skin. The South Asian community knows this cream, this infamous cream, I should say, as Fair and Lovely, and it does exactly what it sounds like it does. It's a skin bleaching cream, and it grew in popularity, I would say, in the early 2000s, where there were huge campaigns across India and across the Indian culture to use this cream because it lightened your skin, which therefore made you beautiful. But the South Asian community wasn't the only community that I didn't fit into, quite frankly. I also felt like an extreme outsider in the community I thought that I looked the most like. While I didn't look like a visible outsider, so I could blend into the crowd or blend into a picture quite easily, my proud South Asian background, my proud South Asian heritage made me extremely different from the Black culture I knew nothing about. And as a result, I couldn't really make connections with the Black community when I was a preteen. It was really hard for me to connect with young Black girls because I was so culturally different. And as a young person, any young person growing up, all you're looking for is community, to feel accepted, to feel wanted, and to feel that you're supported. But I didn't have that from either the communities who I thought that I belonged to. Especially when at about 10 or 11, you're starting to get an understanding of the freedoms and civil liberties that you have as being a part of a multicultural Canada. But what I was experiencing at the time was the fact that, well, yes, I was multicultural, quite literally. I'm two different ethnicities, but I couldn't fit, or I wasn't accepted by those two ethnicities, and it was extremely difficult for me to be able to navigate that. And when I was with the Black community, I remember being bullied by young Black girls because of that difference. So I was being bullied or rejected in some elements by the Black community for being too Indian, and then by the Indian community, the same exact thing for being too Black. So I'm going to paint a picture for you here. I'm 14 years old at this point, and I have no sense of self. I feel ugly, and I feel unwanted from the communities and cultures that I come from. And all I did was long for belonging. Who would accept me, I often asked. Who would think I was beautiful? And this is when I found Facebook groups. There was this one particular group on Facebook where it was a community of mixed race women. And this was so mind-blowing for me at the time, because I was so sure I was the only mixed race person on this entire planet other than my sister. And so when I found a group of these people who felt the same way that I did, where they had these experiences of being shunned by the communities that they come from, and that they felt like an outsider just based on their identity, I felt for the first time in my life accepted by a community. And there were lots of people who had different backgrounds than I. A lot of people in this group were mixed, half white and half black. There were other Asian mixes. There were people who were mixed as well religiously, which I also have a religious mix. And this was just a safe space where all of us can come together and talk about our experiences and then work through these negative impacts together. And I have to say, I'm so extremely grateful for having found that community, even though it was online, because it helped me gain a better or a stronger sense of myself. And it was really the tipping point where I began to undertake a period of transformation. I understood that straightening my hair, lightening my skin, and making sure my nose is pointy actually came from colonial perceptions of beauty, and that I didn't have to accept them. I could be me, I could love me just the way that I was, and there were lots of people out there on this planet who are willing to do that. I just had to separate myself from those who aren't. As part of my journey, I began to forgive those who have hurt me in the past, particularly the two communities that I've come from. I forgave the South Asian community for making me want to change myself and feeling like I had to fit into the epitome of European beauty. And then I forgave the Black community for pushing me aside, for not being Black enough. And I really began to understand that as a mixed race person, I actually carry more privilege in this community because mixed race people are considered, unfortunately, to be of a higher class within the Black community. So when I began to understand that my mixed identity gave me privilege, I was quicker to forgive some of the negative experiences I had. Although it did take me years to accomplish this feeling of worth and self-love. And I'll be honest, there are days where, you look at yourself in the mirror and I'm like, oh God, what's that? And it's something that I still struggle with, but I think for me, finding and connecting with a community of people would eventually help me learn that I belonged, and I deserve to be here no less than anybody else. And I didn't have to change who I was to fit into a community. This helped me to share what media and what I engaged with. So I'd say that I cut off a lot of those negative reinforcements and the negative media that reinforce those negative life experiences. And when I started to do that, I started to feel a change in myself, but then change my outlook in life. And I had my first aha moment, Oprah's infamous aha moment, when I found the social justice movement. And it was through those changes in media that I was actually able to find it. And while I always reflect on my story, and I always start with the negatives, I always like to point out that this story is actually positive. Because of the things that I experienced, I was able to identify that there was something going wrong, and that B, there was alternatives out there. And then through research and learning, I was able to unlearn colonial ideologies and then learn social justice frameworks. And I often think that had I not had those negative experiences, would I be able to connect to the social justice movement as deeply as I am? Would I be able to support and act as an ally in this movement had I not had these experiences? And while the answer is For me, no. I think that my life experiences have definitely shaped my engagement and my passions. This has driven me to create the next generation, or to create the next generation of young people who don't ever have to question their existence on this earth, and their existence in our society and in our culture. So it's definitely led me down a positive path, and it's helped me to find my self-worth. So that was my story. I want to thank you all for listening. It's definitely never an easy thing for me to share, but I wanted to share it because I think that we can use it to sort of frame our discussions in creating your own story. So with that being said, I'm going to move into our next section. So this is more of our workshop section. So if you have a question, please let me know. Happy to answer. Jen, just let me know if there are any questions throughout the presentation, and I'll be sure to answer. So today I'm just going to be talking about the process in which I created this story, and in the process I hope that will help you to create your own. So I think that there are 5 defining features of creating a story. The first is your audience. So who are you talking to? Who is this story meant to impact? Who is this story meant to be told to? Once you know who your audience is, you're then able to dictate where your story goes. And I'll head into some details about each of these features a little bit later, so you get a better sense of how you can come up with an audience and a message, climax, and characters, and so forth. So the next thing is your message. Is what are you trying to tell? What story are you trying to tell? The third is your climax, which is a fancy or dramatic way to demonstrate why you're telling your story. The fourth are characters. So who are the key people in your story who have either acted as a protagonist or an antagonist and supported your growth? The next is a conclusion. You want, in your conclusion, to demonstrate how your story became important. And then your conclusion will then lead your listener or your audience to undertake the type of social change or impact you're hoping the reason. I'll backtrack. You want your conclusion to lead your audience or your listener to take whatever action you want your story to lead to. And then the last is edits. I despise editing and the editing process, but it's an extremely important part of telling your story and making it clear for a listener. Okay, so audience. This is all about who. Who are you talking to? And when we're thinking about who we're talking to, you always want to consider what is somebody's understanding of the subject matter. How much do they know about any given or particular part a particular theme, idea, concept, theory that is included or as part of your story? Because if there's no strong understanding of the subject matter, you may want to preface telling your story with some background information to help guide your discussion. The second thing you probably want to consider is what's going to make your audience or your listener to connect to your story. If you have a room full of tech enthusiasts, talking about technology may actually engage them with your story, whether or not the particular incidents or things that you want to talk about with your story is relevant to tech. Sometimes drawing on those analogies or those concepts will allow people to connect to your story. The third is what style of language should you use? And I always like to illustrate this by saying, if you're talking to a 3-year-old about your story, and if you're then talking to your grandparents about your story, the way you tell a story will be extremely different when you're telling it to a 3-year-old and when you're telling it to an elderly person. Mostly because their life experiences are different, their understandings of the world, their language and vocabulary is extremely different. And so you want to keep this in mind when you're using tone, when you're writing, that your audience's understandings or life experiences should shape the language that you use. And then the last thing is, what do you want them to learn from your story? And this is an extremely important part that will tie into your conclusion at the end and into your climax. What do you want your particular audience to learn? And that what you say in your story, I'll backtrack. What you say to your audience should change depending on what you want them to learn. If you're unsure about who your audience is, I always recommend undertaking some research to get a better understanding, whether it be researching the organization, researching the workshop, if you're delivering a presentation, or to for-profit or government or public. It's a good strategy to always get a sense of, okay, well, what type of person is going to be in the room, and are they going to be able to understand the concepts that I'm talking to, and are they going to be able to relate to them? The second is message, which is, what's the point of your story? Why are you telling me about your story? And you want to make this message extremely clear for your audience to understand. It should be about 2 sentences or less. It should be concise. And honestly, I think that the message is the hardest part to draft. Think of it as the thesis of your essay. It's the thing that will dictate the rest of your writing. So when you're drafting your message, yes, you do want to consider why you're telling your story. What's the point? Also, you want to include what you want your audience to consider, or consider as a result of your story. So what actions or behavior changes do you want your audience to engage with as a result of hearing your main message? What do you want your audience to learn? If you're talking to an audience who is not necessarily engaged in the subject matter that you're speaking to, or isn't engaged in the social impact that you're trying to drive, you may want to tailor your message or change your message to ensure that your audience can learn from it. The next thing is characters. All right, so who are the main characters of your story? And we want to think about what each of these characters brought to your story, and how they made your story better, how they made your story worse, how they impacted you, and what they added to your main message. I always recommend that we want to keep as few characters as possible in a story. Too many characters can be overwhelming. And when you're orally iterating your story or your narrative, it's actually quite difficult for people to follow along if you have 8 different characters and your story is 5 minutes long. People will get caught up and lost in who said what, who did what, and when. So we want to keep as few people as possible. The other thing I hope you consider is to remove names. So in my own story, I never said I never used the names of people who impacted or who were characters in my own story. I always left it broad. I said family, I said media, I said friends. Actually, I didn't say friends, I just said family. But this is to protect their own privacy and identity. And often in our stories, as is mine, I still have a relationship with all these people, and I still respect and love them. Despite sort of the negative experiences I've had, I think all of us have learned and grown from it. But if you want to keep those relationships with people, I recommend removing names. Or if you're bold, you can totally include first and last names, and call people out for what they did. I'll leave that part up to you because it's about how you feel comfortable in narrating your story, but just another thing to consider. And I always recommend in removing names or in support of removing names, you can always replace it with things like my dad or my best friend. So how does that particular character relate to you? And again, when you're telling an oral story or you're telling your narrative, it's easier for your audience or your listener to be able to understand what you're saying or to understand your story if you're talking about a character's relationship to you. Instead of saying, Karen did the laundry after I told her not to, because then the audience is going to get caught up on, well, who's Karen and how does Karen know you? But if you say, my mother did the laundry when I told her not to, they'll be able to make those connections between the relationship you have with your character and you. The next is climax. It's probably my favorite part of the story. So what's sort of like the turning point of the story? What's the hard left part of your story? This is what people will remember. They'll always remember the high points of your story, and included in a climax should always be what made you take action. What was the dramatic event or learning or understanding or reflection or process or experience that made you take action? And it's important because this particular piece will either make or break your call to action at the end. And you don't want that. You want your audience at the end of your story to say, wow, that Jessica really changed my mind about eating green apples, and I will never buy a green apple again because of her story. And so the climax is a really important part of that behavior change. So we want to make sure that it's strong. Again, it's clear for the audience to know. And I always recommend it being dramatic. People like the drama. People like to engage either fortunately or unfortunately, with some of these emotional experiences. So throw it in there, make it your climax, make it the most explosive part of your story. Additionally, the climax should very clearly iterate what changed in your life and how it changed for you. So what was the point in which all the negative or positive things in your story that you said thus far changed? And then how did it change your experience? And we want to make connections between this part of your story, so the climax, and all the things that you said previously. This is how we tie all the elements together into a nice bow. That way, when you make your call to action or you encourage that behavior change, people say, yes, that is it. That makes sense. They get the aha moment that I got in my story. I'm going to move on over to the next slide, which is conclusion. And the conclusion should draw or should iterate or should illustrate what the point of your story is. Why are you telling it? What is the point that you're trying to get across here? And in your conclusion, you want to include what you learned, what you want the audience to learn. What did you learn as a result of your own story? What is that key message? And I always recommend repeating that message that you hopefully included at the beginning to make it extremely clear for your audience at the end to say, yes, okay, this is the message of the story, and this is the social impact, or this is the behavior change, or this is what I'm going to do differently as a result of hearing somebody's story. And then include a call to action or demand action. I like to use the word demand. This is where you tell your audience, based on your story, here's what you need to do better. Here's what you need to do different. And we really, really, really want to drive this message home. So again, get dramatic, Be clear, be upfront, and and really drive the message across. Lastly, this one's a little bit, this can't apply to every story, but if you can, always try to end on a high note. Humans, just by nature of who we are, we like happy endings. You know, we like sad stories that end well, because nobody wants to end a story on a wow, that, you know, this is an unfortunate event and there's nothing that we can do about it. It doesn't present an opportunity of hope, and it doesn't present the opportunity for change. So as much as you can, try to end your story on a high note. And if your story doesn't end on a high note, so if this is still an issue that you're being perplexed by, or that's still plaguing society, what is the opportunity that you can present to the audience that can have the story end on a high note? And the next part, edits, which I know I said earlier, I despise the editing process. I find it quite daunting. It's quite long, and it's tedious work. I always say that however long it took you to draft and write your story, it'll take you double or triple that amount of time to edit it. So be mindful of going in with that, and know that the editing process doesn't have to happen in one sitting. Feel free to break it up. You can do 2 hours of editing one day, 2 hours of editing 2 weeks from now, and then 3 weeks later, you'll have your story. So take it slow. When you are editing, I want you to consider how you can make the story clearer. What can you write within your story to highlight the message, the climax, and that call to action? Are there any complex sentences when you deliver it orally that doesn't really come across in the same way when you read it on a paper than when you orally deliver it? So are there things that or sentences that you can simplify to make that message stand out and make your story clearer? Often when we're writing our stories, we want to include all the tiny details in it, so that people can get an extremely full picture of how you felt, of your experiences, what you saw, where you went. But often a lot of those details aren't necessarily relevant to telling a story. A listener only needs a few key details: who was there, what happened, how you felt, and then what you did about it. As details are the only things that you truly need. And so anything else, unless it's extremely relevant to your story at a later point, feel free to get rid of it. The less fluff you have in a story, the better. And then think about what you missed. Maybe when you first started writing, your message has changed or shifted slightly, or your climax has shifted slightly, or the call to action has shifted. And so when you're in your editing process, feel free to go back and say, okay, well, this detail is no longer relevant, but I'm going to include this other experience that I didn't include previously because it's especially important to the message that I'm trying to deliver. Through the writing process, I always encourage you to ask for help. So getting a friend, a colleague, a family member to listen to what you are writing about, or getting them to help you either draft or edit your story is important. And it'll help bring a fresh pair of eyes to what you're doing. Step away from your story. I know I had said it takes you a couple hours to undertake the editing process. So feel free to jump in, do some edits, and then step away. That stepping away process actually helps you sort of refresh and reset, because I can tell you, when you're in the editing process, you're often so into it that you miss out on a few things. So feel free to step away. And last, but definitely not least, is don't wing it. We think that because it's our story, you know, we know it, we can talk about it, we can narrate it, but the truth is that every single story, even your own, needs to be needs some sort of process. So you need to write it down, you need to edit it, you need it to be clear, because while it is your story and you know it, that's the same reason why you shouldn't wing it, because your audience doesn't know it. And so because your audience doesn't know it, when you tell it, they're not going to understand what you mean by certain things because they haven't lived and experienced it. So don't wing your story. I'm just going to talk about a couple elements in a story, particularly two, that I hope that you can include while you're writing. So the first is a hook. That is included right in the beginning of your story, and you want to use it to capture your audience's attention. What fancy string of words can you put together to bring your audience into the story you're about to tell them? Often there are stories that use emotions, or they use an extreme event to grab the attention of their audience. They use drama, and the hook should always be connected to your message in some way, shape, or form. So don't just say, Sharknado is a real movie, I'm going to tell you why, and then talk about why it always rains. Those two things are not really connected, and so it'll be hard for your audience to understand. So we want that hook to be relevant to your message, and we want it to be as dramatic as possible. And often a way for you to do that is to play up on people's emotions. It's a powerful tool for you to really set the scene. And then emotions are an extremely important tool that you can use in a story, because people, or humans, naturally have emotions. And that's the way that they're actually able to connect and engage and remember stories. So we want to elicit that natural feeling, or those innate instincts when we're telling a story, because it'll help resonate with people as you're speaking. You can use a wide variety of emotions when you're drafting your narrative, but I always recommend sticking with one or two, just so that it's clear. It's clear in your story what the emotion is and what the emotion you want your audience to experience. And if there's too many emotions, it can become very overwhelming, an experience for your audience, and you don't want to overwhelm them with their own emotions. That's definitely a no-no. Just a quick tip about writing your story. I know when I was speaking to the conclusion, I was talking about in the conclusion, people want to hear a happy ending. Sort of similarly, people don't want you to be the sole hero of your story. And what I mean by that is, people don't want to hear that you saved a company from bankruptcy and you made $1 billion of revenue all on your own. This is actually that bragging or that arrogance quickly disengages the audience. They want to know that, yes, you struggled. Yes, you definitely did things to put yourself in a positive place, or to produce positive outcomes, but don't dabble in the sole hero, what's the word I'm looking for? Theory, I'll say, because you're usually not the only one in your story, and there's characters who supported your learning and your growth. A couple more tips on presenting and narrating your story. Do have confidence. Again, this is your story. Nobody knows it better than you do. So have confidence when you're talking about it, and I want to hear that confidence in your not only in your tone, but in your body language. 50% of communication is done through is done non-verbally through body language. So your facial expressions, the way your body moves, or hand movements. You'll notice I'm very talky with my hands. So don't be afraid to put your whole body into it. The second is drama. I think that I said it about 100 times in this presentation already. Drama, drama, drama. It adds impact, it adds memory, and people are more likely to engage if they're hearing all the dramatic things. Third is humor. And this has to be done very delicately, because often people's stories, there are some hard things to talk about, but if you're able to lighten the mood with some light humor about things, people are able to engage with that, because humor has definitely been, I've seen in storytelling, a really strong tool for engagement. So don't feel that you can't also be funny when telling your story, even though you're talking about some heavy things. And then the last is personality. Bring your personality. If you're outgoing, if you're shy, if you're angry, if you're a person who is talkative, let your personality shine through when you're telling your story, because again, this is your story and people came to listen to you. So don't feel that you can't be yourself when you're trying to explain your story. All right, order of events. This is another part of the editing process, where you consider what are the order of events that led me to my climax, which will lead my audience to the conclusion, which is change behavior. And it's important to put your story in the correct order of events so that your reader, or sorry, not your reader, but your audience can stay engaged. If you start with, I was at the zoo, and then I went to school, and then I went back to the zoo, and then I went home, you've already lost your audience, because your audience is confused where you went, what is the chronological sequence in the way which things happened. So we want to make sure that we're putting things in the right order that makes sense for the audience, and so that the audience can understand why a particular order of events led you to your climax. Keep it simple. Again, less is so much more when you're telling your story and you're trying to consider the order of events. And again, we don't want stories that are long and that are overly detailed. Your audience will disengage, I promise you. Even if they're looking at you, they're sleeping with their eyes open, I promise. So try to keep your story as short as possible and as condensed as possible. The order of events, this process really helps you to also highlight the struggles, the emotions, the thoughts, and the actions of your story. So if you know what the struggles are, you know what the emotions are, the thoughts and the actions, put those things in the order which makes sense to your story to be able to deliver your climax as clearly as possibly. Just lastly, I think that to make it extremely simple, what I mean by order of events is what life details from your story are relevant to the message you're trying to deliver to your audience. The truth is, I think every single one of your life experiences, every single day of your life is extremely important into shaping who you are, but not every day. You don't want to bring up every day of your life to tell your story, nor do you need to. So again, we really want to highlight the struggles, the emotions, the thoughts, and the actions of your story. Put them in the correct order to lead your audience to your climax and then your conclusion. Oh, I went backwards. All right, so I'm gonna switch gears here a little bit into stories for healing. So I kind of already went through how I drafted my story and the things that I want you to include when you're talking or when you're considering how to draft your narrative. But I wanna shift gears and talk about how we can actually use our stories for healing. Stories have been, like I said at the precipice of the presentation, have been cultural traditions in which communities were able to connect, share learning, share history, share ideology, share ways of just being. And if I'm being honest, through the process of colonialism, we've seen that many of these groups in which storytelling has been so central to culture, to identity, have been silenced. And the process in which people undertake this storytelling have been lost because of this silencing. But I want us to harness storytelling as a way to protect our communities, to participate in community, to be a proud member of particular communities that you identify with, or to better understand communities and support communities. Stories are all about healing. Stories are all about the person and the individual and the community. So don't feel like a story is just something that you learn from, but it's also something that you can heal from. Like I had mentioned in my own story, it was through the process of hearing of other young women who had a similar experience to I did, was I able to then realize, okay, I'm not the only person with this problem in the world. And I was able to begin my own process of healing. So I'm going to talk about the two ways in which we can view storytelling as a healing process. The first is through community and why, and then the second is through self-care and self-care and why. And so the first one, through community, self-care has been extremely co-opted by capitalism. Often when people think about self-care, they're thinking about, bubble baths and painting my nails and buying clothes, retail therapy. But that's not actually how a lot of communities with oral traditions actually view self-care. And it's been co-opted by capitalism, like I said. And I want us to break that association between seeing self-care as something that you can buy. You can't buy self-care. It's something that you do. And it can be practiced for free. So when we share our story with community, we're actually able to heal. Again, like I'd mentioned, my own story, I was able to heal from some of the traumas that I experienced because I was able to connect with others who were like me. When I have heard other communities' stories of traumas, I was also able to understand and connect with those people. And those, I was able to actually draw on my own traumas and my own experiences to be able to be a part or be an ally in that community-based healing. And so again, sharing stories extremely important when we want to consider allyship and we want to consider how we can support others in driving social change. Another reason why you should totally be sharing stories and not fearing the process by which you do that is to find community. You can find like-minded people. And then you can learn and understand people a little bit better. I think when you get context into somebody's life and their background or their experiences, you yourself begin to reflect on some of the things that you've done in your own life, and you're able to undertake some self-growth, and you're able to expand your own capacity to participate in community healing, but also participate in individual healing. Again, feeling accepted, sharing a story makes somebody else feel accepted if you are the listener. Just by virtue of listening, I can tell you it goes a long way for a lot of folks who just feel like their voices aren't heard. And so if you're listening or you're narrating a story, just know that it's another basic human desire to feel that you're accepted and to have that exchange with somebody else. Lastly, and I think most important, not most importantly, but another extremely important part of sharing stories is to activate community change. Stories motivate people to get things done. I'll think back to the Three Little Pigs story, and how we had three pigs, one very lazy pig, one semi-lazy pig, and then one pig who spent the time to build a house. And the message or the moral from that was, take your time in building something, or take your time to get things done. Don't be lazy, don't be sloppy, put your all into something. And that actually that moral has motivated people to adopt that ideology into their own lives. And hopefully you know the Three Little Pigs story. If you don't, Google, I recommend. It's quite funny, but just another way that sharing your story can be extremely important to community self-care. And so next, I'm going to just be talking about how sharing your story can be a personal self-healing. I can speak to that on my own, and many others who I've worked with who have said, or who have expressed the fact that once they shared their story, they feel a lot better. Because when you share your story, I find that you're often releasing trapped emotions. You're allowing a part of yourself to go out into the world, out into with somebody else, your audience most often. And you're able to, not completely, but definitely start to release some of the things that you're feeling, or the negative emotions that you have associated with things that have things that you have experienced in the past. I can tell you from sharing my story, I'm sure you may have noticed it this session, but there was an intention for that, that I kind of tell it as a third person, as if I didn't experience it myself. And that's because I've told it so many times that I've gotten kind of, not detached from it, but I've gotten to a point where I've accepted it, and I've been able to move on and pull some positive learnings out of it. So I've become comfortable with it. It can also provide clarity when we tell our story. Again, when I think about order of events, and yes, you do know your story the best, but when you start to think about the process, or how things aligned in your life to create, who you are today, it helped me provide some clarity as to, okay, this event caused or triggered this event, and then it actually made me this today. So it helped to provide some clarity and some understanding for myself into my own story. The third is trauma release. Like I said, when we share our stories, we release it into the atmosphere. As an extremely spiritual person, because of my religion, I find, or my religion often speaks to, and my culture actually speaks to, when we tell our stories with an audience, our spirits are talking, our spirits are connecting. And that is another way for you to release some of the traumas that you're experiencing through connection, through a spiritual, but also human connection with individuals. And then the last is to have some sort of creative engagement. And it's a way for you to reflect on your own life, have some self-growth and some self-realization as you go through the process of drafting and writing your story. So there's definitely a lot of ways in which the process of telling your story can ignite sort of social change. It can ignite community healing, but also personal healing. And I just wanted to share two points before as I start to wrap up. And when we tell our story, it's important to be honest with yourself. What are the things that you did wrong? What are the things you could have done better? What are the things that happened to you? And what are the things you wish were different? Honesty is an integral part of your story, and people will see straight through your disingenuity, even if they don't know what your story is, because you tell something that's not true, or when you try to hide something or say it in a way that sounds more appeasing, An audience can pick up on those differences, and you can unfortunately disengage people. I know that a lot of millennials and Gen Z is so wrapped up in social media, which is extremely curated, and it only shows the highlights of our lifestyles. And it's just another way. So social media is supposed to be another way in which we can tell our stories, we can show ourselves to the world, but that is an inauthentic way for us to connect with other people, where I find that when we talk about sharing our stories, it's all about honesty. It's all about the authenticity. It's all about being real, cutting the crap. What is it that really happened to you? And then what is the social change that you're trying to drive as a result of it? So be honest, and also be honest with the fact to say that you're not ready to tell parts of your story. It's okay for you to feel like you are ready to talk about your story with particular groups or with no one or just yourself. I can tell you that there are parts of my story that I do not share with public audiences, and some with friends and family, because I'm not ready to talk about it. But I definitely have created a narrative, for myself. And I started the process of documenting and writing and drafting what I want that story to say, because again, it's a process of self-care to do that. And it's okay that I'm not ready, but there might be a time in my life where I want to talk about these things, because the things that I shared with you earlier about my story, about finding my self-worth and feeling worthless, at one point in my life or the other, I didn't want to talk about that either. So I highly encourage, whether you're sharing it to an audience, you're sharing it to friends, you're sharing it for a presentation or for school or for work, whatever have you, don't feel like you can't share your story. I think stories are so impactful and extremely undermined for their value that they add to society and to our communities, and it is definitely a way that you can drive impact. I just wanted to thank everyone for listening. I left my contact details just up on the slide. If you have any questions, or if you want to have me have a look at your story and provide some guidance, happy to do so. Feel free to reach out. My line and my email is always open.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Really, folks are really thankful for this information. I've been monitoring the chat as you've been speaking. So thank you so much for your time and co-creating and holding this space. So I have a few questions. Yeah. I don't, but if anyone else has questions, please do add them to the chat. But just kind of next steps for moving forward, are there any resources that you've used personally that you'd recommend? And that could be organizations, trainings, to get more comfortable speaking, or even just beginning to tell your story, even like journaling. Like, what kind of tools and resources would you recommend?
Yeah, I think that's the first great question. I think that there are a couple of different things. I think it first depends on what process or what stage you are in telling your story. If you are not yet ready to talk about it, I actually would recommend you heading on over to Medium, which is a writing-based platform, kind of blog style, and read other people's stories. Read what other people have to say or have said about themselves and their own learning, to be able to get a sense of how those stories are told. I think that would definitely be a great first step, and it may help inspire you to include, certain elements or starting to think about drafting your own story. If you're in a place where you'd like to refine your storytelling technique and focus more so on activism and social change, I would recommend Olivia Chow, who was a former MP and the wife of the late Jack Layton, actually runs a online, is it online? I think, well, it's definitely online now, but she runs an online training on how to tell your story to drive social impact. So a lot of this learning has actually come from workshops and work that I've done with that organization. And so I highly recommend checking it out if you're looking to really hone in and become more specific on using stories to drive social impact. And the story doesn't have to be your own always. It can be a story about a community. It could be a story about somebody else that you heard, but it's just a story in general.
Awesome. Oh, what was that called? I sent the name, MP Olivia Chow. What was that resource called? I want to type it out here as well. Institute of Change Leaders?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone in the chat.
Thank you to the chat room.
And then either giving an example, a personal example, or just kind of reflecting on this question a bit, but do you have an example of a time when you have met resistance from folks in telling your story, or what are some tips on how to handle a situation like that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh God. I could tell you stories. So the first, I'll share two. The first is I have a story of I guess mental health would be a broader topic, but on suicide. And I was speaking to a conference room of, I guess you would say, social workers. So people who you would think, again, I say think, would be accustomed to hearing these types of stories or would be engaged with something like this to be able to better their own work. But I was met with a lot of like inquisitive faces, as if my story didn't make sense to them, or as if I was met with judgment of some of the decisions that I made or the actions that I took. And again, this is why I say non-verbal body language is extremely important, because that's how I actually saw that people were resisting. It wasn't necessarily with the things that they said in this story. It was the way that they were physically responding to what I was saying. And I kept going. Honestly, I think that your story is not, and it will never resonate with 100% of people. And I think that we need to, when we do tell our stories, be mindful of that. Not everyone is going to, like I said, resonate. Not everyone's going to take the action that you want them to. Not everyone's going to connect with it. And that's okay. They don't need to. Your story is not for them, but that doesn't make your story any less. It doesn't diminish the value or the worth of your story just because somebody doesn't connect with it. Maybe they're not in that headspace. Maybe they need some capacity to grow in their own mind, and it has nothing to do with you. But I think that it's important to keep going, because whether or not they're actually hearing you, they're at least listening to you. So they're hearing the words, but they may not be absorbing it. And so the more that they can be in scenarios where they're hearing these things, it's kind of like a marketing tactic. You know, you have to see a product 7 times before you actually go and buy it. Same thing with people's stories. You may be the second or the first time that they've heard a story like this. And so they're not ready to engage. So I say, don't take it personally. And the second time I've told a story, I was on a panel and I had told a story, and some of the feedback I had actually gotten from the panel was that I was very formal in the way that I had spoken about some issues, or people had perceived my tone as extremely professional. And while usually I would take a criticism like that extremely seriously, I took it in a negative way, because the panel was supposed to be for youth, which means, and the audience were for youth workers, which I interpreted, and part of their feedback was that somebody had said I sounded like a judge in telling my own story. And I took that advice and I flushed it down the toilet, because the people in this group had a connotation or an understanding of what they think a young person a young Black person should look like, what they should sound like, and how they should tell their story. And so, kind of similarly to what I did before, I don't really care. Again, flush it down the toilet, on to the next. That person has things that they need to deal with. But I think that, yes, on one level, you do need to be mindful of who your audience is, but also be mindful of who you are and what your values are and what your personality is, because there will always, like I said, there will always be people who are not ready for your story, or don't have their own mental capacity to be able to listen to your story. But I think that we need to differentiate between when somebody's criticism or their resistance is their personal problem, or is something that you can actually improve on. I think that's a huge difference.
Sorry, I'm trying to chat here. So I think you also touched on something really important at the beginning about not making assumptions about how your story will be received based on, you know, you were in a room full of social workers, you assume that there would be some kind of baseline understanding or about what you were saying. So I think that's just a really important thing to remember. And we have a question from Frederick. Okay, so she's interested in collective narratives in the sense of how can we bring together several stories that are connected by a common theme and not erase the uniqueness or individuality of each story, but make a collective impact at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are lots of ways of doing that. And the solution is, or not the solution, because I don't think that there's any one solution to anything. But it's just about highlighting multiple voices. I'll give you an example. When I engaged in December 6th, so Violence Against Women event, I always like to bring different types of voices to talk about violence against women. So I like to hear about the experiences of Indigenous women. I like to hear about the experiences of Black women. I want to hear about the experience of trans women. And while those three groups are all women, and they've all experienced violence, they've all experienced it in an extremely different way and extremely varying levels of violence. And so I think there are ways, the way in which we can draw on collective stories without sort of erasing the uniqueness of it is ensuring that we're including a wide or broad spectrum of voices. And I know it's probably like, oh yeah, okay, well, makes sense. But you'd be surprised how many events or women's events I used to go to, and all the panelists would be white and all their experiences are the same. And I've heard women who denounce gender equity or gender pay, and you're just sitting there like, you just want to, I want to jump out the window. But I think that as somebody who wants to, from the sounds of it, you want to bring or amplify the voices of women, we want to make sure that those voices, like you had mentioned, are unique. And they're not monogamous. So they don't all have the same experience, and they don't have all the same sort of outcomes, and that different things, that they're highlighting different things for different people. And I also think that includes sometimes a process by which we all come together and sort of do that editing process that I talked about for your own story, but you do that collectively to make sure that you're touching on things and being representative of your community and of yourself in a fair manner. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. So, yes, okay. Okay, great. Okay, if folks have no more questions, we can begin to wrap up. But I know, Jessica, you had, okay, yes, she said she very much appreciates your answer. Okay, you had some kind of like a next step or activity. So I don't know if we have time to do it now, or if you wanted to explain it to folks and they can maybe do it at home and then
Yeah,
We can either have follow-up conversations, because we will have more virtual events, follow-up discussions, conversations, or they can reach out one-on-one. So if you want to talk about that.
sure. Yeah, so the activity that I was hoping to do was to have a look at the story, because I had typed up my story and I wanted us to have a look into my story and pull out the hook, the message, the climax, if it was there. Because I know there are some things I didn't include in my story. So I wanted us to go through that and see how we can make it better. Because sometimes I feel like when you're given something and you can find, you can walk through that editing process, it actually helps you in creating your own. I'm mindful of time, seeing that it is like 4:20, and I know we're supposed to end at 4:30. So Jen, I'm not sure if you're comfortable with this, so please interrupt, but I'm happy to share a Word document or a Google Doc with the writing portion of my story. And if folks want to engage, you can participate in the editing process in there. And then I don't know, Jen, if you want to host something after, I'll leave that up to you. But yeah, I'll share that. And if anybody would like to share their story or have me have a look at it, or work together to draft it, happy to. Again, my contact information's on the screen. Please feel free to reach out. But yeah, I wanted folks to have an opportunity to look at the sort of writing version and see, and pick out some points that could have been better.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful for sure. One thing that I think we've taken from this, first week of virtual programming is there is a lot more work to do, and these conversations that we have lead to, coming back together in small groups or, a big group and working on specific activities or actions. So I definitely think it would be great to have a follow-up focused on, the editing process and helping folks refine their stories now that they have this background and context. So I will say we will look into that, and also on the survey, make sure that you give your feedback into what you would like to see in that next step, in that next workshop. So we make sure that we can incorporate your feedback. Period. Yes. Does that sound?
Done. Mic drop.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you again. And I want to just note that in the spirit of continuing this conversation around storytelling and hopefully being able to use a bit of what you learned here today, I will be joining Rachel Wang of Evoke Creatives. They're working on bringing more racialized youth and youth from marginalized communities to the forefront of the environmental justice movement, through music and art. And so we are going to be talking about the launch of a new digital storytelling hub. We are still trying to build community and engage with each other online through this process. So that was the idea behind creating this virtual space where folks can share their stories. And so we'll give details around how you can submit your work, what the theme is. And again, it is on Instagram Live, and I know that everyone does not have Instagram. So we will be making the information about how to submit your work and the whole background behind the Storytelling Hub available online in other spaces. This is just kind of a launch event. We're trying something new on Instagram Live. It's an experiment. We'll see how it goes. So don't worry, you will receive that information whether or not you join us on Instagram Live today. But if you have an Instagram, please hop on there. It'll be short and sweet. And we'd love for you to participate. So those are my closing words. Jessica, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of you for joining the workshop on a Friday afternoon. I know every day kind of feels like the same, but nonetheless, it was a pleasure having you, and thank you for the questions. And thanks to you, Jen, and to Girls Action Foundation for putting this together and really highlighting community through these troubling times. Apparently, I can't get my words out anymore.
It's okay. Friday. I mean, you're right, though. Thank you, everyone, for joining on a Friday afternoon. I want to echo that.
It's appreciated.
And I'm just going to put up quickly as everyone exits, if you want to take one more look at where you can give your feedback. You can also email me directly if you have workshop topics, themes, ideas. And we'll also email this around, so don't worry, we'll put it on social media, we'll email it, it'll be made widely available. All right. So thank you all and enjoy. I hope you all have a restful weekend and take care.
Thank you so much, Jen. Bye.
Bye, you're welcome. And Jessica, I'll email you.
Okay.
Or we can wait and see if we have a few seconds on the line.
Sorry, somebody sent me a message, but they're only in the chat.
Oh, no.
Okay, I had this person on Facebook. I'll send them a message.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm so glad that we've started this relationship. I'm glad that you reached out, and I hope that we can continue to work together.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I know I know that you normally have, was it Amplify?
Mm-hmm.
It's called. So yeah, happy to support any of your programming other than this virtual space. So just let me know in what capacity you'd like.
Yeah, I will. I think doing those, like, we did have small groups, breakout groups on the workshop on Wednesday, but I found that there was a good amount of drop off, and I don't know if it was too many things happening in one event. So yes, we can talk about doing a follow-up. I think that'd be great. And can you send me just an estimate of how many your prep hours, like, so I can get the honoraria started for you?
An estimate? Oh God.
Or,
okay.
I mean, not like the number. I don't know why I said estimate, but yeah.
Not record that. Okay, I'll think back. I'm sure it's in my schedule somewhere.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about attendance. I know you had said earlier in the week there were about 50 people who registered, and I think at some point the highest I saw was 22 people. Was that sort of consistent? Like, I didn't know if it was, I know storytelling isn't always as attractive as let's say like advocacy or policy or such. So just kind of curious as to what the attendance was.
Yeah, it was right on track with the other workshops. I mean, yeah, Monday, or I don't know the days anymore. Wednesday we had, I think, 73 people registered, and ended up being 21.
Okay.
So that's something we're working on too. And I think it's really hard because folks do have Zoom fatigue. And while they may be excited about the content, when it comes the moment to join, they're like, do I want to do another video chat?
Absolutely. I've done that.
Yeah. So it's a challenge right now. And I'm not sure, we can talk about ways to work around that. But still, I think really good turnout, especially for a Friday afternoon. So.
Even though the days feel the same, but yeah, I agree. When I saw 22, I didn't know if I was like, oh, people, because I know, again, like, storytelling isn't as like, doesn't feel as good as